Hello and welcome to our PRCA Sports Group meeting. I'm James Stibbs, Chair of the Sports Group, and very happy to have you watching us. Today it is a recorded session on crisis comms in sport. As I think all of us know from the daily news, sport's never too far away from a crisis. Just off the top of my head in the last few months, I can think of Djokovic in the Australian Open, the Russia-Ukraine war and what it's meant for athletes and events, and Chelsea Football Club as well. Peng Shuai's disappearance, COVID, and every event that's taken place. A crisis for a team or an athlete, though, or even a brand or a sports competition, I don't think it has to make global headlines to still qualify as a crisis. These things can happen, I think, much closer to home, but still resonate really loudly for your stakeholders, whoever you are. And that's why it pays to plan when it comes to crisis communications. Because if you have a plan in place, it feels slightly less like you're in the middle of a firestorm. So to help you understand how to do that today are two leaders in their field, I'm pleased to say. First of all, we've got Katie Blake. Katie is founder of Blake Social. She's been described by the Drum as packed with social media knowledge. And in 12 years of working in this field, she's moved from the boardrooms of Facebook to giant brands like Red Bull and Nestle, HSBC, not on the high street, advising them on the moves to make on social. And she provides a range of services to them, from strategy to training. And interestingly, to me at least, describes herself as the unofficial poster girl for Pinot Grigio and chocolate fingers. She's got competition from me on both of those scores, but we'll see how that pans out later. We've also got Stuart Bruce. Stuart founded Stuart Bruce Associates 13 years ago, I think. No, 11 years ago now. And since then, the company has worked with a who's who of brands, including UK Sport, BBC, FIFA, the UN. And like Katie, I think, you've both worked for HSBC. Very recently, Stuart's been working with sports bodies to help them plan their crisis communications for major events. And he's also been called upon for his views by the likes of the BBC, PR Week, The Guardian. So he obviously looks after his own PR as well, which is always, I think, a good sign. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the World Communication Forum Association and a chartered member and fellow of the CIPR as well. So, Katie, I'm going to hand over to you to drop some knowledge on us. Thanks for joining us. Over to you and your slides.
No worries, thank you. It won't let me share my screen. Oh, it will now. There we go. Sorry about that. Right, so I am, as James said, going to talk about detecting, reacting to and recovering from crises, specifically on social media, as that's where I tend to specialise. So I've got a framework I tend to run through with brands. I've been running through them with some Commonwealth Games sports today, in fact. Have used them right down from sort of grassroots sports right the way up to some really big names and some big European tournaments. And so it works quite well across the board for different types of sport. And I've linked in some examples. I've gone for some quite high profile things that hopefully you'll have heard of, so it makes a bit of sense. But if you haven't, there's a lot of screenshots and things in there that will help you keep track. So I'm going to start off with imagining logging in to a crisis kicking off, because if it kicks off on social media, it is very likely that you will find out about it there on social media. So we've got Ollie Robinson being suspended from all forms of international cricket when he sent some really ill-advised historical tweets. Came to light from a troll account, which was then deleted immediately afterwards on the first day of his international test debut. Jack Grealish, when he broke lockdown rules and crashed his car into about 4 different cars was then fined £83,000 and banned from driving for 2 years. Tottenham Hotspur had a very dodgy link up with Dulux as a brand partnership. As an Arsenal fan, I found that quite amusing, but from a sports point of view, not brilliant for them. And Ronaldo, when he moved Coke bottles from the Euro 2020 press conferences and instead told everybody to drink water. Crises in sport are unavoidable, like James said, from really big ones that do make national headlines, international headlines, right down to ones that are very local and only really affect your fans or your local community. It really is what you do next that matters. And I'm a big believer that if you are ready for something, it's not as bad when it happens. If you're chasing your tail to try and get a crisis plan made, when a crisis hits, it really delays you, and it means you're already really stressed out when you get started. So the most common types of crisis for sports companies that I deal with on social media are partnership issues. Like I said, think Dulux and Spurs, when something goes wrong on one side of the partnership. Historical controversial statements, so Ollie Robinson's historic tweets. There have been quite a lot of historic issues. There's a lot of football players, academy players, rugby players who have tweeted or posted something which then comes back to light as they get more famous. Greg Clark from the FA, when he made some really ill-advised comments that were quite racist and sexist to the DMCA. Individual actions of players or high-profile people in that sport. Jack Grealish's lockdown crash, Tyson Fury last week when he beat a plane passenger for harassing him, legal or contract type issues, so Ronaldo moving his Coke bottle when Coke sponsor the Euros quite strongly, and corporate issues, again, like James alluded to earlier, I think Chelsea's owner Abramovich being sanctioned by the government and everything that's now going on with that sale and with the sort of forced publicity they've got there that they don't really want. So whatever the type of crisis you are dealing with out of those, whether it's one of those, whether it's something a little bit different, you want to be prepared before it hits. So you always want to know what a crisis is for your organization. Generally, a crisis has two main components. I would say it's a decisive change from the norm for your brand. So if you're talking to Nike, who I work with, sometimes they get heavily criticized for company ethics on an almost daily basis, if not an hourly basis. And that's quite expected for them. And so for them, that doesn't constitute a crisis, and they don't need to be going into crisis management whenever they see a tweet or a share of a video or somebody talking about their experience working at Nike. For other brands, that would be a big crisis if they're not usually criticized and there's something specific that's happened. And it also has to have strong potential impact for the brand. So somebody tweeting that Wimbledon served them really rubbish strawberries and they weren't impressed isn't a crisis. It's one person or a couple of people who are a bit dissatisfied. If a lot of people started complaining that they'd been served rotten fruit or it was making them unwell, that could be a crisis. So you have to consider what the scope and scale is of the crisis as to see whether it constitutes one. And I would always recommend already having an alert system set up too. So a Google alert for your brand and your sport to make sure that you are getting at least a daily overview of what's being said. Some social listening. So if you're using a management tool for your sports organizations like Sprout Social, they usually have that built in. Salesforce have quite a good one built in. Or you can set up a free tool such as Talkwalker, which will analyze what's going on Twitter and let you know in sort of a daily digest or every 4 hours or however you choose to set it up. And some tools can also alert you if you've had a higher than normal amount of web visits or a higher than normal amount of incoming social media traffic, which can be brilliant because then you can get a push notification or an email that says, there might be something over there for you to go and look at. Your next steps will then sort of depend on the type of crisis, but you will want a crisis framework. So I've got a standard one here, which goes right from something that your customer service staff can deal with. So for an Wimbledon strawberries example, if someone's just tweeting that they've only got 4 strawberries or that they were dissatisfied, you'll probably be quite happy that if you've got customer service staff, they can deal with that. If you had a mass outbreak of food poisoning at Wimbledon and everyone was getting quite unwell, you'd probably push that up the chain a little bit. For sports, you'll want to decide who your key contact is for each type of crisis. It will probably be quite different if it's a sports contract type crisis to if it's something related to an individual player. Who will respond to each type? Where will they do responding and how much responding should there be? So we're going to go through some of those in the following slides. Do you have the contact details for everybody? Again, for sports, there tend to be quite a lot more than there are for most other business types. You will want agent details if you're dealing with people who are high profile enough that they deal with agents, next of kin information for that kind of person if you're doing partnerships with those people, stadium details, that kind of thing, depending on what breaks out. So really you'll want to make sure you've got access to a directory of people that you might need to call on. And who should know about what's going on? When will you issue company-wide communications around your organization or your business? On social media, every employee that you have is a potential spokesperson, especially if they say on their Twitter or their LinkedIn that they work with you. So you want to keep them updated somehow, whether that's through blogs or messages, emails or Slack, that kind of coverage. So my framework for reacting to a crisis on social media very quickly is pause everything that's outgoing while you evaluate the situation. If it is going to take you longer than an hour or two to collect all the information that you need and to deal with the crisis, you want to acknowledge the issue. Most places do this and then remove them afterwards, but there's some examples over the following slides. But you just want to stop yourself from being deluged in messages that's, have you seen this? Did you know about this? Because you will get a lot of that. It does sort of stem the flow a little bit once you've acknowledged it and let everybody know that you're on the case and you're looking into it. Then you want to compile information and create a bit of a comms bank. What do you know about the situation? What do you need to tell other people? What does anyone internally that's going to help you to respond to messages or build a post need to know? Then you do that posting and update people on what the crisis is, what's happened and what you're going to do about it. And finally, responding to questions and queries that come in and then on your social media channels. So your first step is always to stop outbound communications while you evaluate. It can take a couple of minutes if it's a really minor situation. It could take a couple of hours if it's something much bigger, but you want to have a way to stop people from posting on your brand's behalf. So that would be both your own posts coming from your channels, and if you're doing partnerships or you've got someone who live tweets events, or if you're doing anything with players that's a sort of a live ongoing agreement, you'd want a way to stop them from posting during the crisis too. Decide if you need to acknowledge the situation. You don't always, but it will stem that flow of messages we talked about and give you time to activate your crisis playbook, gather a bit of information. You always want to respond in the place that the crisis started first. So if you saw it on Facebook and it came in on Facebook, respond there first, and then consider where else to reach to. I generally wouldn't recommend shoving it out everywhere because you can increase the amount of crisis comms you then need to do if you put it somewhere at this stage that haven't heard about it yet. So if people are going mad about something on Twitter but you haven't seen it on Facebook, at this stage, leave it on Twitter. I tend to use an hour as a rule of thumb. If it will take you more than an hour to collect the information you need and form some kind of response, acknowledge the situation on your social platforms. Then create your comms bank. You don't want to start replying and then change your mind halfway through. And you want to make sure that you know what you're trying to say so that it's really clear. Ideally, you'll create this in line with your other departments as you've got them. So PR departments, customer care departments, so that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. As a general rule for this, you'll want to note down what's happened, any photos or videos that are available. If something big has happened, that social media tends to be covered in them. How you found out about it, who was alerted and when, any specific actions you've taken in response to finding out about it, any real or potential consequences you're dealing with, and if it's relevant, the steps you're going to take to stop that from happening again. Now it's time to start reacting. So your step 4 is to summarize the situation and explain what's happening next. So if it's an ongoing situation, you might want to link to an FAQ on your website, which gives people more information, gives safety information or an estimate time of interruption. So for all the coronavirus disruptions, it was really good for a lot of places had an FAQ where you could go to and see, will I still be able to come? How will limits on tickets affect me? When will I find out if my ticket's still valid? How will the coronavirus vaccine passes work? That kind of information. Being somewhere really clearly written out on your website means you don't have to keep repeating yourself, but it also gives people somewhere to go and refer to. And then at this stage, you do want to respond across all of your relevant platforms. And you tend to want to keep it quite neat and on the case. So on Facebook, have one post and update it from the top down. So once you've made your first post, if you then need to add to it, add that text above your original post, but inside the same post. Then everybody will see all the information together. Otherwise, you run the risk that the algorithm serves your older posts or your newer posts and the people don't have the full picture. On Twitter, use threads, so reply to yourself so the whole thread is visible. And again, people can go to the end and make sure they're up to date. And on Instagram, if you're issuing smaller updates, because of the way the algorithm works slightly differently there, use stories to use smaller updates and use feed posts when you've got a big update to keep people up to date with. And finally, to respond. So in any type of crisis, especially in sports, you're going to have people who support, people who dissent, and how you respond to them is quite key. So I would always recommend having a pressure relief valve. And by that, I mean allowing people to give their opinions on your posts. So resist the urge to lock down your profiles or your posts and stop people from responding, because it gives you somewhere that you can control and somewhere that people can vent. If you turn off comments and replies, you will find that people still make those comments, but you've got a lot less control over them. So generally speaking, you can put a post up, for example, on Facebook, invite people to come and have their say, because they will put your statement up, people will reply to it, but it means as the crisis gets older and dies down, you can control it a little bit. You can make sure that any swear words, anything that you would go against your community guidelines is removed on that post, and you can also make sure that the crisis conversations stay on that post rather than taking over your whole page. And I also think the rule of 2 is a really good thing to remember here, and that is when you respond to something publicly only twice. After that, if it's a situation that you can resolve, such as a customer care issue, you can take that onto a private channel, so you can get them to DM you or email you or phone you. If it's not, after 2 responses, you are unlikely to find common ground and change someone's mind. So at that point, you can graciously step back and sort of walk away. You don't really want to get dragged into elongated 16-point replies. You aren't going to get anywhere with it. In 12 years, I've never seen anyone on the 5th response decide that actually they are being unreasonable. So let's see the framework in action. So brand partnership's gone wrong. Tottenham Hotspur here announced that they had their first ever paint sponsor in Dulux, just as they were building their new stadium. And Dulux had some quite funny banter about the lack of good defenders that they had, about trophies they had with football fans. So paint the dusty trophy cabinet, and Dulux tweeted back, "Don't be silly, services need to be dust free." They made a for sale image with an unused trophy cabinet, and made a joke that the Dulux dog might be a better defender than their current options. It trended on Twitter almost immediately because everyone was a bit taken aback by it, and it got covered everywhere. It was on the BBC, it made it onto ITV News locally, it went all over the sports, all over sports Twitter. Then the Spurs manager happened to be giving a press conference about the next game quite soon afterwards, and was asked if sheepdogs were his favourite dog, which got a big laugh from the rest of the press room. And was then asked about the paint partnership and Dulux, and had no idea sort of who they were or what the partnership was. Eventually, Dulux did acknowledge the situation and did an apology post. This is quite a good one. Really deeply sorry for the posts this morning. They don't reflect how we feel. We are investigating and we apologise to everybody, which sort of nicely closed it down. But they did get 2.6 thousand replies to that. So again, it's a good example of letting people have the conversation there. They were quite good at making sure it didn't take over everything else that Dulux do. And Spurs came back with what is, even as an Arsenal fan, I will say, is a pretty brilliant response. Quite a playful pun. We'll gloss over it this side. And then they let that go. They didn't respond any further to people who commented on this, because it was a corporate risk and a reputational risk, but there was no real need to go and chat to fans about it. They weren't at risk. They were unlikely to be massively upset by it. So they could sort of end the crisis there and then get straight back into posting about Tottenham and what they were up to. Historic tweets, a very different type of crisis. So just after lunch on his England Test debut, some tweets that were sent by England's brand new pace bowler Ollie Robinson were unearthed by a troll account, which was then very quickly deleted. There were about 25 of them. There was 4 here, which are some of the better awful ones. It also happened to be the same day that the ECB launched their new anti-discrimination drive. So they'd had all of the England players, including Ollie Robinson, in black T-shirts, talking about how they won't stand for racism and things. So it was pretty bad timing for them. They did quite well, though. In acknowledgement, the head of the ECB came straight out and acknowledged the situation, said that they'd been made aware of the tweets and promised a really full investigation into it. And they kept the comments on, which gave people a chance to come and chat, and there were loads of comments. I mean, Sky Sports got nearly 700 comments. This is the ECB tweet, got nearly 2,500 comments. The Facebook page got about 4,000 comments, which provided fans a chance to come and say what they thought, which was very divided between, he was a young 16 to 18-year-old man, he made some ill-advised comments, but he's a grown man now and we should forgive him too. There's no room in sport for that kind of attitude. And they did their posts, their sort of acknowledgement and posts very quickly on the same day. It was quite a well done, well-oiled media machine. Ollie gave a short statement which was live streamed onto Twitter as well as onto news platforms, where he apologised for the tweets, apologised to his teammates for what had happened, and announced that he wouldn't play any further part in the test match while the investigation was happening. Sussex Cricket Club that he played with also did a statement, quite short and sweet. Pleased that he's apologised and taken responsibility. We will look into this, we'll work with him and the ECB. And he released a written statement too, and also the ECB did one, but very similar, so I haven't screenshotted that one. Sussex even and the ECB answered specific questions about Ollie Robinson by linking to his statement, so they directed people to a site on the website where they could go and read about the investigation, about what had been said. They didn't, however, offer any personal opinions on the individual case. But they did get the ECB's anti-discrimination campaign manager to come and answer some more general questions about what cricket are doing about discrimination, about inclusion, about what this meant for that specific campaign that had just been launched. For a day or two, he answered a lot of questions, which let people think that their voice had been heard and that their comments on the sport that they love were important. They did stick really well to the rule of two as well, because there were some heated debates and some quite high-profile people in cricket got involved, which sort of fueled the fire. And the ECB then announced afterwards that it would be reviewing their social media practices. And as a quick lesson overall, I would always recommend having a process for reviewing players' social media. You can do it manually, although depending on how long they've had an account, that can take some time. There's AI that can do it. There's agencies that can do it. I've been working with some teams to do it. If that's not possible, I would encourage them to make old accounts private, not because I think that everybody's tweeted awful things or because I think it would be excusable if they have, but because things change. For example, on Twitter, a lot of Ollie's old tweets wouldn't have been visible before the change that meant that your tweets at somebody became public. And culture changes over time, so what's acceptable, again, not that I think anything he tweeted ever would have been acceptable, but in some cases that it might be that all you need to do is just review them and make sure that they are still an accurate reflection of who you are and who you want to be seen as. Very quickly, Jack Grealish, England player and Aston Villa player, did a really nice video, got very highly praised in the media for telling his fans to stay at home and listen to the coronavirus guidelines. Less than 24 hours later, he was spotted driving around Birmingham, fleeing from a damaged Range Rover where he'd crashed into 3 people's cars. Villa acknowledged the situation within an hour, did really well at that, said that they hadn't managed to contact Jack yet, but would give an update and were aware of the situation. Jack released a video on Twitter, which is where he did his initial video. He went to where he'd sort of started the problem. It was also where a lot of the video of him being drunk and in the wrong slippers and things was being shared a lot. Apologised a lot and encouraged people to stay at home, and said that he would now be doing the same. And Villa then released their own statement quite quickly, condemning his behaviour because they had to really, but it's very nicely written. We don't agree with what he did, but he's fixing it. We are working with it. And they announced that his fine would be paid to a local relevant charity, which is quite a nice touch, I think. But another quick lesson from Villa, they released this statement, which is part of a big, longer statement on the website, and it then crashed their website for about 4 hours, so you couldn't access it, which did get quite a lot of amusing-ish jokes, like as if crashing his car wasn't bad enough, he's crashed the website too. But if you are going to post a statement for something that is big and has got a lot of media attention, it's a good job. It's a good idea to speak to IT or your website hosting and make sure that you've got the capacity to deal with that, so people can read the statement. So once you've detected, investigated, posted and started to respond, if that's necessary, how do you know when you can return to normal after a crisis? So here are 3 really quick questions that you can use to sort of help you read where you're at. Has the crisis ended or is it ongoing? So for Jack Grealish, over time that became old news. They didn't need to keep responding to it. For Ollie Robinson, that was ongoing for a while the ECB did a full investigation. When things are ongoing, you might want to tweak what you're then going out with otherwise on social media. If it's something that's happened and is over to a certain extent, you can move on a lot faster. What are your reach and reply figures telling you? Are they going back down to normal? They're unlikely to peak up really high and then drop straight back to your normal levels. But if you've got a downward trend overall, then unless you anticipate something is going to spike that back up, you can probably test starting to post again. And also consider what content you are returning with. If it's something that's likely to worsen the situation, is it something you can make, sort of someone could make those sort of funny connections and gags with? You might sort of reawaken the crisis. So I would always recommend going in quite gently. And again, some of the big Premier League clubs did a really good example of this in coronavirus, when there were some awkward situations around who could attend what games and the coronavirus legislation. And so they leaned into some of their more popular content around their sort of legends, matches where they had really strong results against competitive rivals and things, so that their sort of strong fans would sort of be directed away from what's happening with current games and remember why they love the club and what affinity they have with the club and the good things the clubs are doing in the community. So when you're ready to get started on your crisis playbook for social media, here are the 5 steps I tend to start taking people through. So like we said, define what crisis is for you and your organization. It's going to be very different if you are quite a small grassroots sport to if you are a big Premier League club. But it's important to know what it is and also what your scale of responding would be. Step 2, get your monitoring set up using keywords so that you can respond to those things in real time. Step 3, create your response matrix. So who would your key individuals be? And then for that, step 4, create your approval pathways. So for most types of crisis, you do want to be responding fast. The longer you sort of leave it to simmer, the more awkward it is to start managing it. So to be able to do that, you want to know who's media trained if you need to get someone on video, or if you do need to give press interviews, who can produce a statement for you quite quickly, whether that's on your website or on social media. Who do you need to have sign off on new posts? What is your fastest route to approval if something is ongoing and you need to share it now? Most places will have sort of a general approval list, but that might take a couple of days. If you needed to get something posted in the next 2 hours, how could you get that done? And step 5, know your benchmarks. So how many comments do you typically get? How many replies do you typically get? What's your average reach of posts? Because if you know these ahead of time, you can assess how big a crisis is, how big it's getting, and what stage it's in. And you can also, it will help you to spot when you're getting back to normal as quickly as possible. So I hope that that's been helpful. And James, if you've got any questions, I would be happy to hear them. Otherwise, I will hand over to Stuart.
Katie, thank you so much for that. I think that was the perfect blend of theory and practice, which is so important, I think, to bring these things to life. I mean, I've got lots of questions, but I'm interested to hear what Stuart's got to say as well. So I'm going to limit myself to a single one. What do you think when brands come out, or brands, athletes, teams come out of a crisis? What do you think is the most common lesson that they learn from how they handled it, or what they would do differently next time?
Generally on social media, it's that they have either not responded and think that they should, or that they rushed out with a first response that then they have to change down the line. So I tend to get pulled in somewhere in the midpoint now, either like this has happened and it happened 2 days ago and we haven't done anything, but now it's out of control, or this has happened and the social media person replied a little bit, or someone started saying something and now we've changed our mind and that's made people angrier. So I'm a very big believer that if you've got a bit of a playbook in whatever size that needs to be to fit your organization, it gives you that framework to run through so that nobody stresses out and goes, oh, I'm not dealing with this at all. Or conversely, I will respond to this with what I know now, and that ends up being wrong. There is always the chance that you'll respond with all the information you've got and it will still be wrong, but that's why I have the acknowledgement step there, because it gives you a bit more time to collect your thoughts while also having said something. And there's some examples in the slides of places, but Villa did it really well. They didn't really have anything they could say because they hadn't managed to talk to Grealish, but it bought them time to then come out with what was quite a concise but impactful statement.
Thank you very much.
No.
Now, Stuart, can I invite you to talk to us a little bit about your experience and your advice in this context?
Thank you, James. I will just share my screen if you give me a moment. And there we go, we're off. So yes, I mean, James has given a very good introduction to what we're going to be talking about today on the webinar. In terms of the background that I've got in crisis communications. You can see here just some of the variety of organizations that I've worked with over the years. And I think one of the key things to make about crisis communications is often the very best work that you've done is the work that you can't talk about because it's actually worked. So you've successfully prevented an issue from becoming a crisis. That said, if people do want to talk about any of these, some of them I can share anecdotes and experiences with, and there's obviously things that we learn from them all each time. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the difference between kind of where we are today and where we used to be in crisis communications. So this kind of iconic image that we see here of the aircraft crashing do the crash landing into the Hudson River was in 2009, and perhaps was one of the first times that a kind of news story really broke on social media. And one of the things that I often talk about is today, when we're doing crisis communications, we don't want to just think about the 24-hour news cycle. We actually want to talk about the 24-second news cycle. And in baseball, you've kind of famously got the kind of the 24-second rule. And that's why we need to start thinking of the kind of the 24-second news cycle and constantly be monitoring, constantly be understanding what's happening out there and always being ready to respond. And I think one of the things there is one of the golden rules of crisis communications always used to be never say no comment. That's still true, but actually what social media means is that your very first statement is often effectively no comment, because it's acknowledging that you know something, acknowledging that that you know and that you're going to respond within a certain time frame. And as long as you respond in faster than the time frame you promised, that's usually good enough. But effectively, you're also saying no comment, because at this stage, you don't know enough to comment. Because stories can break instantly on social media. So one of the other things that you need to think about is, in sport, preparation is the key to success. You know, so famously, the England cycle team hired Dave Braceford as its performance director, and it was all about finding those marginal gains that would improve performance. And in crisis communications, it's just the same. The critical time is before the race. It's before the crisis. It's before the match. That's when you can do the most important work that's actually going to have the biggest impact on how successful you are at managing that crisis. So one of the things that I like to look at is the 5 Ps. And I'm going to pause for a moment and let you try to work out what they are. I'm actually going to show you the clean version on this presentation. I don't always do that. So perfect planning prevents probable poor performance. You can guess what the shorter word was yourselves. But it's really important to actually have that crisis communications plan in place. Now, obviously in this short webinar, we can't go through all of the steps of the things that you need to put into that plan. But what we can do is talk about some of the key principles that you should be thinking about and that you should be including when you're putting it together. And the first of those is about being open and honest. And it's about making it people and emotion-centric. Unless there's a reason not to disclose something, and a very, very good reason not to disclose something, then you should be looking at being truthful and honest and open and transparent as possible. And in your plan, you've got to have that commitment not to mislead. It's got to be front and center, because in a crisis situation, there's going to be lots of different voices. There's going to be lots of people arguing about what you should do next. If you've got those principles, these principles here set out in your plan, it actually gives you a framework to make better decisions. And if you do have doubters there, you can point them back at the principles in your plan. And one of the things I always try to do, in fact, not try to do, I always ensure happens, is the very first part of that plan is going to be that statement of principles. And it's going to be signed by the most senior people in that organization, whether that's the CEO, whether that's a chair. And very often in sports organizations, it's quite to have both, because you might well have a board. You might well have the operational CEO, and they're not necessarily the same people. So it's really important that you get them to sign off on these principles, because what that enables is the operational team in the crisis can then actually make decisions based on this framework. So the other ones you want in there is you only want to be using checked facts. And I'm going to come back to this because it's such an important point, and it's also incredibly difficult because it's in direct conflict with that need to act quickly. How on earth can you act quickly if you don't actually know what's happening? And the final one of those key principles is you need really clear lines of responsibility. Who's going to be doing what? Who's going to be doing sign-offs? Who's going to be doing media interviews? Who's going to be responsible for social media posts and monitoring? Who's going to be creating a log of what happens? Who's going to be looking after the people most directly involved? Because very often we put far too much focus onto the media or onto social media and forget that there are actually people involved. You actually have a duty of care, whether that's to fans, whether it's to players, whether that's to agents. So you've got to be clear about who's going to be doing what and when they're going to be doing it. But the biggest question you need to ask in a crisis communication situation is, what is your objective? What is it you're trying to do? Because the truth is, you can't satisfy all of your different stakeholders. You can't satisfy everybody. So is this about protecting a sponsorship deal? Is this about protecting ticket sales? Is this about ensuring that grassroots participation isn't damaged? Is it about regulators and politicians? Is it global regulators versus national regulators? Be really clear about what it is you're trying to achieve, because often in a crisis communications situation, and sport is no different to any other organization or company, the problem organizations make, or that people make, is they attempt to do too much. They attempt to fight on every front. And sometimes you've actually got to accept, we're going to lose here in order to win here. But you've got to do that rationally. That's got to be something, a decision you make, rather than it just happening by accident or by default. And one of the other things you can do is you need to actually test your crisis communications plan. You might think it's the most perfect plan in the world. Trust me, it isn't. Until you've actually robustly tested it, you do not know if it is going to work. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. You can do a virtual sandbox. So there are companies out there that have got software platforms that enable you to simulate an online crisis. You can actually see news sites in real time. You can see Flitter, because of course we wouldn't use Twitter in a simulation, would we? Or Facebook, and see what's actually happening on these sites. And one of the things that happens then is actually some of the doubters in your organization, if they sit in this simulation and they're faced to it and they need to make these real-time decisions, they're actually going to understand the power that, that you have and how helpful you can be, and why they should be listening to you in a real crisis communication situation. When you've been making points about that's far too long for an approval process, once you've taken them through the simulation, they'll actually understand that. And ironically, one of the things I often find when we do a simulation is that the people with the money, the people who kind of are making the investment decisions, are willing to spend more money after they've done a simulation on preparing for crisis communications, because they understand the danger, they understand the risk better. The challenge you might have is actually persuading them to pay to do the simulation in the first place. But once they've done it, they will almost always take it more seriously. And as well as just doing the kind of virtual sandbox, you can also do much bigger simulations. So you could actually do a simulation where you do mock news conferences. You can, you can actually make it big and live. You can actually take people out into the real world environment and do something in a stadium or an arena. You can actually get people to understand what these different scenarios are. And one of the best ones that I've done, or my favorite, is where it wasn't a sports one, but it was working with an energy company, and they had an absolutely brilliant CEO. He was like made for media. He didn't put a foot wrong in any of the rehearsals or the simulations we did. So we were trying to think, how could we really put him through his paces and test him? So what we did is, when the simulation was over, we had a camera crew hiding behind his garden hedge that jumped out on him on his driveway. It did phase him. He wasn't ready for that one. He thought it was all over. And it wasn't yet. So you can make your simulations really testing. And some of the other things you can do if you're running this type of simulation is you don't tell the client when it's going to happen. You don't actually know when a real life crisis is going to happen. So you give them a month time frame, and you know you're going to be running it during that, but then you will hit them out of the blue. So they've actually got to treat it as a real life one. And that means it's going to be on a Friday afternoon. It's going to be on a Friday evening when they're at the pub. We're deliberately going to choose a time when the things like the director of communications is on holiday, because that's when the crisis really will happen. It's when you're least prepared for it. And the whole point about kind of running that simulation is to get you ready for the worst. And another really important question to ask yourself is it really a crisis? Because quite frequently, what somebody thinks is a crisis isn't. It's simply an issue. It's actually no big deal. Just because you're getting lots and lots of criticism on social media, or there's some nasty stories about you in the mainstream media, TV's having a go at you, newspapers are having a go at you, doesn't necessarily mean it's a crisis. You've got to go back to that original question about what are your objectives? What's the impact of all this going to be? Is it actually going to affect something that matters? And is it going to have a long-term effect? because very often what happens is people overreact, or they react too quickly, and they actually play a part in creating the crisis by the way that they react. And then when you do that, when you do decide that you've reached that point, you've then got to make sure that you're consistent and that you're kind of in the way that you handle it. And the other question you've got to ask is, who decides? Who actually makes the call that this is a reputational crisis? And I've deliberately used the word reputational crisis here because there are different types of crises. There are organizational ones to do with operational issues. So often it's a lot more clear cut there. If the power goes out, that's an operational issue. If there's a fire, that's an operational issue. But reputational crises are harder to actually know when you've reached that tipping point. So there are two people or two levels of responsibility here. There's yours as the PR or communications person. You make the call that you've reached that tipping point, and this is now a reputational crisis, but you're advising the board or the CEO of that fact, and they trust you enough to make that judgment and to make that call. The other issue that we've got to think about is, what's the difference between mainstream media and social media, and mainstream media and social media? And what we've got to think about here is, actually there isn't. A story can blow up on social media and become a mainstream media. When there's a mainstream media story, one of the things you'll be wanting to watch for is it actually being picked up and talked about on social media? Does this have the potential to become something bigger that we need to be reacting to, and how do we need to be doing that? So you can use kind of mainstream monitoring tools to kind of know what's being talked about, but today there are kind of better tools out there. So you can use tools like Newswhip, which actually help you to identify how viral a story is likely to become. So in advance, when you first spot something, using a tool like Newswhip, you can predict how big it's going to be. And if you actually look at some of the kind of you go and take a look at some of the ways the tool's being used, it's surprisingly accurate in terms of giving you that kind of indication of whether something is going to grow and whether or not you need to make it, bigger. So one of the other kind of things about, is it really a crisis that we need to be thinking about, is often you have a kind of feeling from people within an organization that actually this isn't a crisis. So on the one hand, you've got the people that overreact and they want to do things too quickly. On the other, you've got those who kind of look and think, no, this will go away. This will all blow over. And perhaps one of the kind of the best examples of this will all blow over, this isn't really a crisis, is one that was actually in my kind of own backyard, because I live in Leeds. And if you look at what's happened over kind of Yorkshire County Cricket Club, that was most definitely an example of where senior people ignored what was happening. Not accidentally, they deliberately ignored it in this case. And the whole kind of the racism towards Azim Rafiq and the way that kind of Yorkshire County Cricket Club handled this, there were just so many red flags. They were told by people I know, spoke to the chair and the chief executive and warned them well in advance that this was, they needed to be doing something on this. They attempted to kind of persuade them that they needed to get professional support in there to help them handle it, but there was just this kind of blanket refusal. And if you look at what the result of that, you've had kind of sponsors like Emerald, Yorkshire Tea, Anchor Butter, they all were rapidly pulling out. The financial cost to Yorkshire County Cricket Club is going to be very hard to recover from, but let alone all kind of the issues around kind of international games, etc. All of that was preventable had they actually handled it properly at the start. And one of the reasons you have problems like that is this. Too often in a crisis communications situation, the hippo makes the decisions or calls the shot. And quite frequently, they're wrong. They're driven by egos. And one of the problems that we have with the hippos in sport is there are a lot of them. You know, in a kind of a normal company, then that actually might be a limited number of people. It might be the CEO, it might be the chair, it might be kind of one or two other people on the board. In sport, it's often far from clear cut who the most important person in the room is. You know, is it the star player? Is it the athlete? Is it the sponsor? Is it the governing body? Is it the chair? Is it the CEO? And actually, all of these competing voices is one of the reasons why you often don't see that clear-cut decision-making, because you've got lots of hippos. And it just makes it really, really hard to work out what you should be doing next. And I actually wanted to return back to some of those key principles that I was talking about at the start of this session. And one of them was about the importance of people and emotions. So when you're crafting your statement, you've got to be thinking about, how does it make people feel? It's all about them. It's never about you. And one of the really good ways to actually make that statement work is, don't just make it a written statement, actually use video. You know, whether that's a pre-record or whether that's live, actually using video is a really good way of getting across the point you want to make and proving that it's genuine and heartfelt. And it can actually, and one of the kind of powerful things you can do is mainstream media will actually use owned media. So I did a project last year with a client where we recorded a video statement, which we used the in-house team to do that. I scripted it, and we had an in-house videographer that shot it and edited it. So this was owned media that was intended primarily to put onto their website, but it was actually picked up and used by mainstream media. BBC, Sky News, ITV, all ran substantial parts of this because we provided good content for them that we knew was usable content. You know, that it was going to be safe and possible for them to use. So think about the emotion. I love this kind of Maya Angelou quote, but I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So think about the emotional impact of that message that you're using. And the other thing you've got to do is, as well as getting that emotional impact, is get the speed right. You know, there's nothing worse in a crisis than a vacuum. And see Northcote Parkinson, he of the famous Parkinson's law. This is another quote from him, talking about kind of your failure, how a failure to communicate will be filled by rumors and misinformation. You know, if you're not putting yourself into that space, then other people will be filling that space for you. And one of the really important things to remember here as well, and this is backed up with lots of academic research, is that once somebody has a strong opinion on something, once they really strongly believe it, then actually you telling them that they're wrong and giving the truth makes them believe it even more. It actually reinforces their opinion. And that's why it's so important that you're the first one out there. There are going to be scenarios when you're not, and it's too late. Then often the best people to combat, to rebut that kind of untruth are other people, not you, because you're no longer believable on the issue. But if you can get third parties, influential third parties that the people who believe it already might be inclined to believe, they are far stronger advocates than you can be. But you don't do that after the crisis. You get those people in place before the crisis, which is why that kind of preparation and that crisis planning is so important. And somebody else that's kind of spoken about emotional honesty, and I would well recommend reading some of Alistair's books on this, is Alistair Campbell. And one of the things that he talks about is how people are far more reasonable than you'll think they'll be. But in order for them to be more reasonable, you've got to be open and honest with them. If you explain why you made that mistake, why it went wrong, what the problem was, people will understand. They will give you that benefit of the doubt. But if you attempt to conceal it, you don't apologize, you attempt to hide it, you attempt to dodge it or evade it, why would they? Why would they give you that benefit of the doubt? So you've got to put an element of trust to people. And one of the other things that you need to do is don't be afraid of repeating your point. Just because you understand it and you think, and the people around you understand it, doesn't mean to say that people out there understand it. And this is particularly true when you're doing things like broadcast or traditional media interviews. When you're doing that broadcast interview, there are going to be certain points that you need to make. The journalist's job is not to ask you questions that make it easy to make that point. So you've got to learn things like bridging techniques. You've got to do some media training so you can actually get that point across. And you might want to get that point across more than once in the interview and phrasing it in slightly different ways. So if you are doing a live interview and there's an edit later and there's a short clip played, you want it to be that, you want to try to make it that it's the point you wanted to get across. And another really important point, which was on those key principles at the start, is actually knowing what you're talking about, actually getting the facts. And sadly, just asking people around you is not going to work. People aren't necessarily going to tell you the truth. That is not the best way to find out what's happening. Now, they might not be deliberately misleading you. They might not remember properly. They might not know. So they're just giving you a quick answer because it's what they think. There can be all sorts of reasons why. So one of the things you always need to do is to remember the old journalism adage of if your mother says she loves you, check it out. You've got to second source the information that you're putting out there. You've got to ascertain yourself, why, if it's true. And one way of doing that is simply to ask the question more than once, to ask why. If somebody tells you something, keep going down into different layers until you actually get to the truth, to make sure that what you're saying is what actually happened. And I just wanted to kind of return to one of the things that I talked about right at the start, is that often the very best crisis communications case studies are those that you can't talk about, because people or companies that handle crises really well, you don't hear about them. It's actually been done in a way that it's never become that social media crisis or that mainstream media crisis. That's why I do lots of judging of awards, and I'm always slightly dubious of crisis communications ones, because they're just the high profile ones. They're not necessarily the best examples of crisis communications, because it's impossible to enter those into an award. All of the best crisis comms I've done, it's 18 hours. Talk about. There's other stuff I can talk about, but it ain't my best work. And I just want to kind of finish by summing up on some of the common mistakes that people make. And all of these contribute to making a crisis worse rather than solving it. So they don't tell the truth. That could be deliberate or it could be accidental. They're both bad. They're too slow. They don't react fast enough. There's poor planning. They haven't actually prepared for this. And that contributes to some of the other mistakes that we see here. It means that the right resources aren't in place. Your common everyday media monitoring tool, which works perfectly when the volume is low, might fall over if you're suddenly hit with, instead of the usual hundreds, you have thousands or tens of thousands of posts that you need to be monitoring. So put, the skills available in your in-house comms team might be brilliant for selling tickets or for kind of getting sponsorship or doing the day-to-day stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're equipped to do crisis communications. If you wanted to hire somebody to launch baked beans or an FMCG product, you would not want to talk to me. That is not my specialist area of expertise. If you wanted to talk about reputational crisis or digital or measurement issues, come talk. because I can do that. You've got to make sure you've got the right resources in your team to be able to handle this. A plan hasn't been tested. It's been written and looks brilliant on a piece of paper, but until you've rigorously tested it, you don't know that it's going to work. It will need tweaking. This is a really common one you see in sport, is that leadership and decision-making is really fragmented and confused. That you can't act, so you've got to try to use that planning and testing process to clarify that. So when it does actually happen, you can make those decisions rapidly. So that hopefully covers most of the most common mistakes and leaves us with a little bit of time for James to kind of ask some questions and open it up for discussion again. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and hand back to James.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was an excellent summary, I think, and exceeded certainly all of the things I'd be able to put into a presentation about crisis comms by some margin, and was the only presentation I think we've ever had at a sports group meeting with a hippopotamus in as well. So in the spirit of leaving people wanting more, we're going to make sure that your contact details are part of the notes on YouTube, so that if people want to find out more from YouTube, then we'd invite them to get in touch. But I'm going to confine myself to a single question, if I may, Stuart, to you, and that is the potential difference between a crisis in a corporate compared to a crisis in a sports organisation or a sports team. And I'm thinking particularly here about the point that you made more than once about a people and emotion-centric response. Because, of course, we know that people feel very differently about sports, clubs, teams, athletes than they do about their baked bean brand or an FMCG or their bank. Have you got any thoughts about that in particular, and what's, perhaps people who have joined a sports organisation from a company that's not from a company, how people may respond differently in the sports world to worlds outside?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question carefully because I'm thinking of a real life example, and I'm going to be careful I don't give away the real life example. It actually goes back to that very first question you should ask about what are your objectives, because often your first inclination is to think of the people that are really passionate about it. But actually, they might not be your most important stakeholders, because eventually they often will forgive and forget. Whereas if you've lost your sponsor or the regulatory body has changed the rules because of what's happened, that's much harder to recover from. So I think for me, that's the most important point, is put those emotions and things to one side, because you're going to be feeling emotional about it as well. The very fact you're working in sport means often you're doing it because you love it. It's your passion. Put that to one side and think, actually, what am I really trying to achieve here? What does a disaster look like? How do we avoid that? Because often it's different to what the emotional thing is.
Thank you. That is not what I expected you to say, but makes complete sense.
I'm intrigued as to what you did expect me to say.
Well, I just, perhaps this is one for later, but certainly as a sports fan, I know my associations with sports clubs and athletes run much stronger, and I would have expected you to say, let's focus on those people who have got the strongest connections. But you're quite right to make the point that, that the piece of elastic that binds those people to those sports organisations is in many cases unbreakable. So better to concentrate on those whose bonds perhaps are a bit looser or weaker, and address those audiences first. So that's a really good point. You two, thank you so much for joining in your evenings to tell us, our viewers about Crisis Com. As I said, if you want the contact details of Stuart or Katie, please look at the notes on the recording. I'm sure they'll be glad to hear from you. In the meantime, thanks again for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure and I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
James.